The Bowl of Heaven, written by Evangeline Adams, famous astrologer, narrated by Lori Carvelli of Three Keys Astrology. Chapter 12, Astrological Marriages, My Own and Others. I've had several proposals of marriage, every woman has, or could have had, but only one that I considered at all seriously, and that was the one I accepted from the man who didn't catch the knickerbocker. Two of those came to me much earlier in life, stand out because of the dignity and wealth of all men. The first, from my Boston employer, Mr. Lord, was once foretold by Dr. Smith. I was not unappreciative of the honor done me by this distinguished and courteous gentleman, but I was totally unresponsive. In the first place, I did not love him, and in the second place, if any second were needed, I could tell, by a comparison of his horoscope and my own, that we were wholly unfitted to each other. The second was much more difficult because the man in the case was both socially and astrologically congenial. He was Sir Franklin Symonds, the celebrated sculptor. Sir Franklin first came to me as a client on the introduction of Miss Lillian Whiting, and inasmuch as he, for many years, had been a student of astrology, we recognized at once the points of common interest in our horoscopes. Before we knew it, friendship deepened, and on Sir Franklin's part, into love. I don't know what might have happened on my side if it hadn't been for two things, both of them connected with astrology. The first was Sir Franklin's mid-Victorian idea about women and their jobs. He wished to take me away to his beloved Rome, to install me as a chatelaine in his beautiful palazzo, and introduce me to a life of pleasurable leisure. And leisure didn't appeal to me. I just moved from the hotel because I couldn't stand seeing so many women sitting about doing nothing, to Carnegie Hall, where I knew everybody was working and trying to accomplish something in life. But the man did attract me, in spite of the voice within me which kept whispering, "Give up your profession. Never! Be Lady Symonds instead of Evangeline Adams of Carnegie Hall. Never!" I might have succumbed to my gallant suitor if it hadn't been for his moon. I saw the first time I looked at Sir Franklin's chart that his moon, governing his relations with women, was badly afflicted, a condition which suggested that our relationship would probably end either in my death or my unfaithfulness. And since I had the world before me and New England behind me, I found either alternative most undesirable. I mention those incidents not to boast. 3 proposals for a woman who has had 40 or 50,000 private talks with men is rather a sorry showing. But I offer them as evidence of the sincerity of my belief that no marriage can be successful unless it is achieved and conducted on the astrological plan. Venus must smile if her votaries are to be happy. 2 years ago, a New York society woman gave me her daughter's dates, and I saw right away that the daughter's Venus was terribly afflicted and would be for another 12 months. "Your daughter's under very bad conditions right now," I said, "the worst she'll have for 28 years. Make sure she doesn't marry before next winter." "But she is getting married," the mother replied with a confident smile, "and to a very fine young man." She mentioned the name of a well-known physician of unquestioned social standing and professional promise. "I can't help it," I insisted. "Your daughter should not marry this year." She did marry. Within a year, that young doctor was confined to a private sanitarium, suffering from paresis. Today, he's just a maniac. Just a maniac. This matter of Venus part in human happiness is one of the most difficult things I have to explain. "Now your Venus," I said to the young man the other day, "is in Aries." "Aries?" And then I remembered so few people recall the 12 signs of the zodiac: Taurus the bull, Gemini the twins, Cancer the crab, Leo the lion, Virgo the virgin, Libra the scale, Scorpio the scorpion, Sagittarius the arrow, Capricorn the goat, Aquarius the man pouring water, Pisces the fish, and Aries the ram. "My Venus consorting with a ram?" explained my visitor. "Better far the goat, or even the scorpion." "Not at all," I laughed. "Aries is the idealistic sign. Men with Venus and Aries place women on a pinnacle. They're very romantic, beautiful lovers, the Romeos of the world." "Go on." "Abraham Lincoln had Venus and Aries." "Lincoln and me?" he shouted. There must be a mistake somewhere. Lincoln's case and yours, I continued, are quite different. It is true that your Venuses are in the same sign, but under varying aspects. Lincoln's was stimulated by Neptune, which made him unfaltering in devotion to an ideal, whereas yours is largely under the influence of Mars. But I will say, for your comfort, that most of the people who have a similar Venus also have a few other things in common. Take Cancer. Some men with Venus in that side are afraid of women, and others are very demonstrative and dependent on affection, but they're all tenaciously loyal and extremely fastidious. Cancer men have fewer love affairs than most, not because they're more virtuous, but because they're more fussy. And another thing Cancer people have in common is conviviality. New York City was founded when Cancer was on the ascendant, and that's why New Yorkers are always going out to dinner. It is the greatest dining out city in the world. Do Cancer men make good husbands? He said. Well, I replied, that depends. Are there any famous examples? He asked. Certainly. Dante, John Jacob Astor, Balzac, Jay Gould, Francis Joseph, Henry Ward Beecher, Napoleon. I mean famous husbands. Oh, Napoleon was a pretty famous one, wasn't he? And in his personal life, he was typical Venus and Cancer person, self-indulgent, comfort-loving, and so fond of the pleasures at the table that he met his death from overeating. Generally speaking, though, such people make agreeable mates, especially when they're attracted to people in complementary signs like Pisces. Then I added with a laugh, but for the life of me, I can't think of any Pisces woman right now famous enough to marry into that group, unless perhaps it's Mary Garden. She's Pisces. Mary Garden, a fish? I gave up. There was no use trying to explain, as this literal-minded young man, what he called the fish is a very fine sign. Michelangelo, Dickens, Victor Hugo, Edgar Allan Poe, and George Washington had Venus in Pisces. If a girl with a Pisces lover comes to me, I usually tell her to marry him and to be quick about it. Women in love with Taurus men, on the other hand, I tell to be patient, and they become a habit. It isn't all men with Venus in this sign that are immoral, although some of them are, but they're slow to give their real affections, and even after they're married, they're inclined to neglect the little things that make women happy. Why don't you tell your wife that you love her? I asked one day. Why should I? He replied in unromantic Taurus way. I married her, didn't I? Venus and Gemini people run equally true to form. They resent any kind of demonstration. They don't wish to be touched. We've all seen ladies 1 or 2 years old who hate to be hugged and kissed. Babies 1 or 2 years old who hate to be hugged and kissed. 9 times out of 10, their Venuses are in Gemini. And another thing, Gemini women are often the gold diggers of the world. I made the last remark to a man not long ago. I'll have to tell you, my friend, Avery Hopwood, he said. He should have known it when he wrote the play The Gold Diggers. He did, I replied. He's a Gemini himself. That's why he knows so much about them. The man was amused, and even more, when I told him that his own Venus, which happened to be in Scorpio. I warned him to look out for women of the wrong type because such men are apt to fall in love with women below their station. That's right, he laughed. I've never been in love with a decent woman yet. Once in a while, I apparently find an exception, but there's always an astrological explanation. I know one man, nearly 75 years old, who has a Venus which is nothing to brag about. But that man is so popular with young girls as if he were a movie hero. Last winter, when he was in the hospital, the nurses fairly fought to take care of him. The reason? His Venus is under the influence of the planet Neptune, a condition which invariably makes the old attractive to the young, and vice versa. Take the case of a literal-minded young man, Venus in Aries, which isn't so satisfactory by itself. It was Mars that came to his rescue. Sometimes Mars is a destructive influence in the horoscope. It happens to be favorable to his Venus. If it were unfavorable, well, I'm thinking of another man born on the same day who was cursed with a terrible Venus. The other man is dead, but his Venus was in an unfavorable aspect to Mars, and what do you suppose he wanted to see me about? 2 different women were suing him for the breach of promise while he was engaged to a third. The point to be remembered is that all Aries people are not idealistic any more than all Libra people are undemonstrative, or all Taurus people immoral. Much depends on where Venus was when the person was born. Otherwise, we should never be able to reconcile the Venuses of such differing Leo people as George Sand and George Bernard Shaw, Barney Barnato, and Irvin Cobb. Of course, the very best Venuses come under temporary affliction. But these can always be foreseen by consulting the stars. If the person's single, these afflictions mean that marriage should be postponed to a more favorable time. If already married, they usually indicate danger from scandal. Every day I warn a caller or a correspondent against the latter catastrophe. I can't mention this particular girl's name. She was very much in love with a New York banker, in fact. She said she was the mother of his child. She told me her lover was about to bring a suit against his wife as to be able to marry her, and she gave me the dates. "But he mustn't do a thing of the kind, not now," I exclaimed. "He's just inviting ruin, the disappointment for you." The next day, Thanksgiving, the banker himself came to my studio, and for an hour I pleaded with him for the girl's sake, his wife's sake, for his own sake, and most of all for the community's sake, to take no action at his wife at the time, or until temporary affliction to his Venus had passed. But he was a disbeliever, and drunk with success. He went into court with charges which proved to be boomerangs against himself. The whole world knows the rest. Sometimes, of course, my warning is heeded. From one husband whose wife was on point of running away with another man, I received this note: "Dear Miss Adams, you have accomplished much more for my wife than I, her husband, could have done toward making her contented and happy and willing to do what she knew herself to be right. My reason for this letter is to ask what you will ask that you send the indications for the June man. You will not paint them any more illustrious than possible. And I enclose some more good advice, like that in your last letter. It certainly did wonders. Of course, my duty is to tell only what the stars say. God's the painter of the astrological picture, not I. And in this case, I had no compunctions in leaving the tale quite unadorned. The stars showed there were good reasons why the June man couldn't marry this love-sick woman, and there were 5 of them, a wife and 4 children. These material marital cases also come to me from third parties, especially third parties related to the man or the woman. In fact, the mother-in-law letter is almost as usual in my experience as a mother-in-law joke. Often it's a one-sided statement of a tangled domestic affair, but with astrology's age, I try to read between the lines. This last year, I've had the most interesting correspondence with a woman in a foreign land whose interest in her daughter's love affairs was leading her far from the path of wisdom. Even without the help of the stars, I might have surmised from the older woman's letters that the young woman was to blame for a good many of her troubles, and that the mother was to blame for the rest. And the horoscope of the 3 persons concerned proved this to be the case. So I wrote the mother and daughter a long letter in which I told them the latter's husband was not at all bad, as they thought he was, and that she would do well to be nice to him if she knew how to be. Some weeks later I received this reply: "Your letter arrived on the last night of the old year. You said you believed by the time it reached me there would have come a change for the better. Well, on her birthday, December 29, she came up to me at bedtime. I always come straight to my room at the dinner table and stay there out of his way. And her face was radiant. 'Mother,' she said, 'he loves me. He says he thinks I am beautiful and that he's proud of me and that I must never, never leave him.' This was one of the first times he broke and loose since they knew each other. I could see she was a good deal comforted. She says if he really loves her, she can stay. It's been our custom on New Year's Eve for my daughter and me to be together and kiss one another at the stroke of 12. This time we read your letter and she went down undressed and then returned at 11:15, kissed and embraced me, wished me Happy New Year, and would not stay. I asked her to stay, as usual. She said she was tired and sleepy and went away, and at the stroke of midnight I heard her in her husband's room under mine. The next day I said to her, 'You would not stay with me as usual, but I heard you at midnight in H's room. But I came up and kissed you and wished you a Happy New Year. It was my place to go to him. And after Miss Adams' letter, I'm sure I did the right thing. He was very pleased. When I try to do right, you ought to help me. You've done a great deal of good already, and things are different.' A little later, I wrote this mother a frank letter about her own responsibility to her daughter's affairs. 'It's necessary,' I said, 'that you should be careful in your own attitude towards your son-in-law, as I see your horoscope affects him from several angles. Even unconsciously to yourself, You may have taken an attitude earlier with your daughter or with him which has kept him from showing his better side. To her, your Saturn is unfriendly to his Mars. Your Neptune is unfriendly to his Saturn. Your Mars is unfriendly to his Jupiter. Your Uranus is unfriendly to his Mercury. And your Venus is unfriendly to his Saturn. Everything about you tends to bring out his more independent, unsympathetic, and selfish side. In spite of this most brutal frankness, I still retain the goodwill of the anxious mother, and not so long ago I had a letter from her asking me about the possible revival of a youthful love affair of her own. Appreciation is a very fine thing. It makes me feel that I'm doing some good sense in the world, and I often say that people who do take care of my advice are better witnesses on the side of astrology than those who do, for the simple reason that remorse is more vivid emotion than gratitude and more frequently expressed. 2 years ago, a woman came and told me she was going to be married. I urged her strongly to delay the ceremony on the grounds that her conditions for marrying were the worst they'd be in 21 years. What do you mean by that? She asked. I mean that there's something wrong about your marriage, something impracticable, perhaps illegal. Of course, she laughed at me. She found her beau ideal, and she married him. The other day she came in again. You were right, she said, about not marrying that man. What was the trouble? I said. Nothing much, she smiled grimly. He was a bigamist. Of course, hundreds of positive examples could be given at the offset of these negative ones. In fact, I'm thinking right now of a two-generation example among people I know and love. Years ago, a woman came to me who occupied a high social intellectual position in the community. She was in love with a well-known man, an artist and an author, and I remember it. He was a man of an unimpeccable character, not at all fitted according to the stars to make mate with the woman who was my consultant. I felt I was taking a great responsibility, but I insisted that she had not found her destiny. The woman went away partially convinced. She did not break off the engagement, but she did delay its consummation, not once, but several times, and in the end, she fell in love with another man astrologically suited to her, with whom she's still living in the greatest mutual happiness. Naturally, she and her husband became frequent callers, and in the course of years they began to ask me about their daughter's love affairs. She was the most attractive with the most suitors, and none of them met my astrological standards, and none of them succeeded, either because of the parents' tact or the girl's common sense, in persuading her to marry. Finally, without mentioning any name, the mother brought me dates of a young man who was especially attractive for her scope, complimentary to her daughters in all the vital ways, as we have been discussing, and containing a promise of a brilliant career, if not in writing, at least in something to do with literature. The other day, the editor of one of our best-known magazines entered my studio. I have come in, he said, to thank you. Thank me, I replied, puzzled. Thank me for what? For my wife, he said. I could have hugged that young man, not because he'd furnished another evidence of astrology's eternal infallibility, inasmuch as I was becoming accustomed to that sort of thing. Chapter 13, The New Natology. Some of my best-known cases, Caruso's, King Edward's, and most recently Charlie Murphy, have had to do with life and death. But on the whole, I think I have been more useful in the matter of birth, in telling husbands and wives when to have babies and when not to have them. I have whole families of happy, healthy, lucky children who've been born on an astrological schedule. If I have the dates of the mother, it's simple enough to determine the period, which is especially auspicious from a physical standpoint for her to have a baby. If I also have the dates of the father, I can determine very closely the time of the year in which the particular family should arrange to have a baby, a time that will produce a child whose horoscope will be favorable for himself and his parents. I was discussing this phase of the science the other day with a man who'd been coming to me for many years. He knew that the theory of astrology from Chaldean times to present day is that the position of the stars at the time of the birth determines to a large extent the life of the individual. He knew that the universe is like a great clock, a big bend of the signs of the zodiac, moving through those 12 signs, and the planets are continuously moving, not with nervous frequency of minute hands and second hands, but slowly and inevitably, like the seasons. Planets that represent at your birth meaning one thing: those that stimulate you those that stimulate your sign from time to time, meaning other things. But it never occurred to him that any particular combination of these stars might mean it was a good time or a bad time to have a baby. If you believe in astrology at all, I insisted, you wouldn't think of having a child without first consulting the stars under which you would have probably been born. If, for instance, you knew November was a bad month for having babies. It is, he laughed. I was born in November. Some years it is, I replied. Let's suppose it's a bad month for the year, and February is a particularly good month. Wouldn't you be foolish if you believed in astrological teachings that plan for a November baby instead of a February baby? Wouldn't you be foolish to run any risk of having a November baby? Well, that sounds like birth control. Oh, but it isn't, I insisted. It's birth release. If a young wife knows that she can surely have a good baby, one that'll be healthy, strong, and lucky, isn't she going to be all the keener to have one? The date of conception, I explained, is important as it affects the date of birth. But as such, it's a most important event in the child's career. That's discouraging. Not at all, I answered. To have babies brought up into the world when the stars are favorable should be the biggest thing in anybody's life, and that's the greatest happiness. Take, for instance, your own youngster. You could have had a better baby. You couldn't have had a better baby if you planned for it. Don't you suppose, he laughed, that I finally did plan to have a fairly good one? I mean, planning astrologically. I did not laugh. I was in one of my most serious moods and refused to be jostled out of it by his levity. I have no sympathy with a person who grin and bear at school of obstetrics, in which the father does the grinning and the mother does the bearing. It's very true that some mothers just naturally have an easier time than others, but it's also true that some mothers have an easy time with one child and a hard time with another. In fact, it's a common thing for a mother who has had a very easy time with several children and suddenly to have an exceedingly hard one. Sometimes there's a medical explanation for these things, sometimes there's not, but there's always an astrological one. The planet Saturn, for example, tends to increase congestion, contraction, nervous tension, factors which should not be present at a successful birth. If my sins are not forgiven me for any other reason, I expect they will be for the lives I've saved by telling mothers not to have babies while the influence of Saturn is in the ascendancy. But you mustn't think that this advice is always to postpone babies. More often, I'm thankful to say that it's the other way around. Last week, a girl came in weeping because she didn't think she could afford to have a child. Her husband was of the same opinion. He'd even suggested an operation which would prevent her from having children. I sent for my husband. I sent for that husband. Go ahead and have babies, I said. You'll support them all right. How did I dare take that responsibility? Because a father's horoscope indicated that children would be very lucky for him. Instead of being a liability, they would be an asset. Their very presence in the family would mean more money, more advancement, more luck. Children lucky in their own signs and sympathetic to the signs of their parents must bring luck to the families into which they were born, a phase of having babies by the astrology that would make an effective end of the present practice of careless begetting. Parents who would not stop to consider the prospects of their unborn children or even the advantages of an easy childbirth might show temporary resistance in the hope of benefiting their own fortunes. Sometimes I'm so optimistic on the baby question that my clients do not believe me. Here, for instance, is a letter which came to me from a trained nurse. Many years ago at Copley in Boston, you read my horoscope and I sent a friend, or rather a patient to you, who was in her 49th year and married many, many years, childless. You told her she was to have a child born in the year 1910, and she went away incredulous, and now she encloses me a check to get a delineation for that child born Boston, Massachusetts, Suffolk County, 4 o'clock, September 9, 1910. I suppose it is this sort of thing so utterly natural to a believer in astrology and so amazing to the unbeliever which made my friend say that he felt naked in my presence. I am sorry, I can't help it. The stars are above questions of modesty or immodesty. I fear I'm doomed by my profession to have not a disarming presence, but a disrobing one. I believe that much of my future service must be in this field of astrological eugenics. I'm not tired of telling people how to straighten out the tangles that have already been snarled up in their lives, but I'm ambitious to be of even greater service by telling them, or rather their forebears, how they can avoid those tangles. But I must realize that it's difficult to obtain the cooperation on part of both husband and wife essential to the production of the perfect child. I know that only children's parents worry. I know that the only children I know that the only children parents worry about are the ones they already have, and so I'm concentrating my efforts at present toward helping fathers and mothers bring out the possibilities of their youngsters they already have, and postponing until a more receptive future the consideration of babies they know not of. Perhaps, too, I'm introduced and influenced toward this conservative policy by drastic effect of some advanced information that I've had on a young woman to whom motherhood is still an uncharted sea. One girl opened the conversation with me by asking, "How about a child born?" She named a period of 9 or 10 months in the future. "It's a very bad time," I answered. "I hope you don't know anyone who's thinking of having a baby then." "I know one who isn't," she explained, and I learned afterward that she postponed her wedding, which had been set for the following month. I cannot have it on my conscience that overenthusiastic feminine disciples are postponing marriages to acceptable young men, or perhaps going into the highways and byways to snare unacceptable ones because of me or new natology. But there are no dangers in the more conservative field, but there are no such dangers in the more conservative field of child training. Already I'm beginning to meet as grown-ups the babies whose horoscopes I read, and I'm learning every day from my own observations or the reports of others how closely time has fulfilled astrology's prognostications. Just last week I came out of a fitting room in Harry Collins' dressmaking establishment on 56th Street. Even astrologers must wear clothes. And was accosted by a fashionably gowned woman who was waiting for her turn. "Miss Adams," she said, "you don't remember me, but I came to you 20 years ago on the date of my baby girl. She was 3 years old then, and you prophesied success through the feet." We laughed a good deal over this, and we were very skeptical. But today here, and she gave me her daughter's name, which you will immediately recognize, my little girl is one of the best known dancers in the world. Success through the feet may seem an extraordinary thing to see in a horoscope if you don't believe in the stars, but if you do, you know they govern every part of our anatomy, even the salts of the body, and anyhow, it is no more extraordinary than already mentioned case of Geraldine Farrar, whose horoscope when she was a very young girl, before she developed the voice that made her famous, indicated unmistakable success through the throat. I've often find in a grown-up client's horoscope signs of talents in the line of work quite foreign to the one in which he's spending his life, and yet, when I ask the subject, the answer is almost invariably this: "Yeah, that is what I wanted to be, but my mother wouldn't allow me to carry out my ambitions." One man said to me only last week, "My father was an engineer, so I felt I had to take on an engineering course in college, but I didn't know what it was all about, and I've never set up a transit except to lay out a tennis court." This man had been born under Neptune, as many of my most interesting children are, and that planet, like Uranus, makes people invariably wish to do something different from the thing their parents have done, and they will either do it or suffer untold misery from being forced back into the family mold. Every child's stars are fixed. The only responsibility parents have so far as their children's mental gifts are concerned is to encourage them to develop whatever the horoscope indicates, and not to try to change your children's destinies to suit their own parental whims and ambitions. The usefulness of astrology in helping boys and girls to pick out their careers was brought home again to me not long ago by an extreme case. Mrs. Oliver Harriman called me on the telephone to tell me she was worried to death about her son, Bordy. The boy just wouldn't fit into any of the niches which were yawning open from the scion of the home of Harriman. Instead, he would act. What should he do? I looked up Bordy's date and found he couldn't help himself. He had the same aspects that I called attention to in the case of Ina Claire. He has to act, if not on the stage, in real life. So I advised his mother to let him go. She did. His first part, by the way, was that of a butler, and as I write, he is giving a very credible performance at the Belasco Theater in support of Nance O'Neill. Many grown men and women tell me that they now see their success in life is due to the fact that their parents, consciously or unconsciously, gave them sufficient freedom to choose, to fulfill their horoscopes. And of course, I mean reasonable freedom. I don't mean that parents should resign all their prerogatives to the stars. I told one of my clients that she should encourage her daughter, Betty, to be an individual, and she did, until the word became a familiar sound to the child's receptive ear. One night, this past winter, her mother was entertaining guests, of whom Betty was very fond. "Mother," she said, "can I stay up to dinner?" "No, dear, just this once." The mother saw she would have to resort to some expedient to comfort the disappointed child, so she reminded her that so-and-so and so-and-so valued playmates weren't allowed to stay up for dinner. "But mother," protested Betty, "you said I should be an individual." "I always like to have the parents' dates as well as the child's. One mother of my acquaintances had two daughters. The first absolutely worshipped her, the second hated her. Finally, the battles between mother and daughter reached the stage where the girl attempted to kill the older woman with a gun. The mother's horoscope was all right by itself, but the girl's moon governing her relations with her mother was in conjunction with her Saturn, and trouble was inevitable. Years later, I had told the mother not to try to control her daughter's destiny, but she obeyed. She disobeyed astrology's teachings. I had a vividly contrasting case. A boy born with club foot. His horoscope indicated the form of his affliction. His Saturn was badly afflicted to Pisces, governing the feet, but also indicated most favorable conditions in which his moon was concerned. A specialist said there was no hope for the boy unless the parents could afford a nurse to massage the foot every day in as many years as might be necessary to restore it to health. The family could not afford a nurse, but the mother, true to conditions indicated by the moon in the horoscope, gave up to her life that the boy, nursing and treating him every day for 6 consecutive years. Today he's riding a velocipede. I think that's some kind of bicycle. Next week he gets his first bicycle. All his life he should give thanks to his mother and his moon. You cannot begin too early to bring your child up the astrological way that it should go, or at least to consult the stars to its infant dangers and possibilities. I was reminded forcibly of this fact one evening when 2 winters ago, when Ray Long, the editor of Cosmopolitan magazine, was sitting in my studio in Carnegie Hall chatting quite unprofessionally with Mr. Jordan and me about his new baby. In fact, he'd just come from the hospital where he left Mrs. Long and young Ray doing just as well as I had said they would do when I first knew of the approaching event. From habit, I suppose, I turned to my desk and consulted my books and charts. "I'm glad," I said, "that everything's going well, especially tonight." "Why tonight?" "Because there's indications of a rather serious upset for the baby." "No chance of that," said Mr. Long. "I have just left him crowing lustily." We all laughed, and Mr. Long went home. In 30 minutes he was on the phone. "It's all right now," he said. "But at 9 this evening, a little later, I left the hospital. The baby had a stomach attack that nearly finished him. The nurse was trying to reach me the very moment we were talking in your room. Take the little Longworth baby as a mere recent example. She was born in Chicago, February 14th, 1925. Like many other admirers of the child's illustrious grandfather, I was interested in the event, but unlike most of them, I immediately looked up her horoscope. The first thing I noticed was that Neptune was in her house of birth the moment she was born, which meant the child was not destined to stay where she was born, and she didn't. The moment her mother was able to leave the hospital in Chicago, she and Paulina caught a train to Washington, D.C. The baby also had Jupiter, the planet ruling money, in a good aspect to Saturn, ruling older people, and Uranus ruling the unusual. The combination indicated that she would profit through an older person in unusual ways. The next newspaper bulletin concerning Paulina Longworth told of a bequest of $5,000 as a saving bank nest egg from one of her mother's wealthy friends at Chicago, and a few weeks later I read somewhere that her mother received a similar sum from a manufacturer of a well-known face cream for a written testimonial, and that Mrs. Longworth explained this unusual action on the grounds that she was given money for her daughter Paulina. There were other indications in this baby's horoscope, as there are in every baby's, that the parents would be glad to consider in mapping her future life. Paulina has Venus in Aquarius, a human sign, in aspect to a practical planet, Mars. This combination has produced some of the world's greatest artists. She also has Mercury in Aquarius, indicating possibilities as a writer or an inventor. But of these aspects are especially desirable into this one, the Aquarian human age, as she has Jupiter in her house of travel, indicating she will very likely spend some time in foreign lands and that she will prosper away from home. This is a sign that is hard to beat, and wise parents who know about it won't try. Cecil Rhodes had this sign, and in spite of his great abilities, he never made a good home. He never made good at home. What he did when he went to South Africa, all the world knows. So I say to Alice Longworth, as a piece of unsolicited advice, if Paulina wishes to travel, let her go. For many years, I've been doing the most interesting type of baby work for able young women who make it in their business to place deserving children who have no homes in deserving homes which have no children. Among the youngsters she's placed since she undertook this unusual profession are the adopted children of Helen Gould Shepherd, the beloved philanthropist, and Nora Bayes, the most equally beloved ballad singer. Her method, so far as I was concerned, is to give me the dates and birthplaces of the children she has under consideration, and to obtain for me the advice as to what kind of home surroundings they will best be fitted and from which they should secure the greatest help for their highest development. In some cases, of course, she also gives me the dates of prospective foster parents. The theory on which she's working on is an absolute sound one, and the results of the efforts have been so far gratifying, not only to her clients, but to her astrologer. I believe it'll be equally satisfactory to the fortunate children who pass through her hands. The destinies of even the smallest children are written in the language of astrological heavens, so that he who runs intelligently may reap their rewards. Chapter 14, Twins and Things. People laugh at having babies by astrology, and maybe I would too if I weren't an astrologer with an astrologer's knowledge. Quite early in my Boston experience, one of my most enthusiastic and faithful believers called me up to say that she simply must see me immediately. When I asked her what the matter was, she answered, "Twins!" I was surprised for my friend and was a maiden lady of a long respectable standing, but as an astrologian learns to expect everything. So I told her to come and tell me about it, or them, and of course the children weren't hers, but they were twins with only a few minutes difference in their births. I made out the two charts in accordance with this difference and began my reading with the remark, "These two children are as unalike as if they'd been born different decades, one in India, the other in Sweden." My caller gave out a great shout of triumph. You might have thought that she'd just hit the $1,000,000 bet. As it turned out, she'd won a notable victory over her Back Bay physician, an old-timer, who hadn't waked up to the value of astrology as an aid in medicine in the world. He had insisted that the science couldn't be true and that as final proof it offered these two babies born almost at the same time, one as dark as a proverbial ace of spades, and the other as fair as the queen of diamonds. But almost is a big word. And in the case of these twins, it made all the difference in the world. At the moment of their birth, the elder twin, the last degree of the fair complexion, happy disposition sign of Sagittarius, was rising, giving him the jovial, beneficent, optimistic planet Jupiter as his star of destiny. At the moment of the birth of the younger twin, the sign Capricorn, indicating a swarthy complexion, serious disposition, was rising, gave him the melancholy Saturn as his dominant planet. To an astrologer, the thing was as clear as black and white. But to the straight-laced Boston doctor, well, I never did hear what he said, but I presume he fell back on the worn-out excuse that it was only a coincidence. I have known dozens of such coincidences. The famous Morgan twins, Gloria Vanderbilt and Thelma Converse and Lady Furness are all as unlike in temperament and experience as any two girls I've ever met, and yet I had a similar case this summer which brought me by an anxious uncle. Two boys born within 15 minutes of each other in St. Louis had developed divergent personalities. One was very, very good. The other one was horrid. Upon investigation, I found the planet Uranus, which causes a child to display rebellion and contrary characteristics, ruled by one boy, and jovial, beneficent Jupiter ruled the other. With this knowledge, I was able to give the mother of the twins worthwhile advice as to how to deal with the two temperaments, especially the bad one. They were quite different planets in the case of Mrs. Reggie Vanderbilt and her sisters, and of course the results were different too. But the principle is the same in all cases, and a few minutes before the birth of the first twin and the birth of the second, a new planet came into ascendant, creating one of these fundamental changes in the horoscope, which, on the whole, science of astrology is based. The resulting difference of confirmation of astrology, the astrological accuracy, not refutations of it. But there are periods in every year when no radical changes in progress, and these static periods, the good ones I mean, are the times when babies should be born. It's impossible, of course, to pick the day and hour for the birth of an unborn child, but it is possible if parents follow astrological directions to pick a period, a section of the year in which conditions would generally be favorable for them and their prospective children. And if they do, they can count with reasonable certainty on the type of individuality their offspring will possess. I could give hundreds of cases of twins born at such times where the two children's tendencies and histories have been almost identical. A remarkable case, writes a news reporter in the Times of October 29, 1925, of twin brothers being injured at precisely the same time but in different parts of town, occurring yesterday morning at Eastbourne. Fred Crowhurst of Uppertown Gardens was cycling with another lad when he came into a collision with a motorcyclist and was badly injured. He was taken to a hospital. When soon afterwards a police constable went to inform the boy's mother and ask him to dress the wound in her son's leg, the policeman went to the house and saw the boy with a serious injury to his knee, whom he presumed to be the lad that he'd left a few minutes before at the hospital. The constable asked for an explanation, was told, "This is Gordon Crowhurst, a twin brother of the lad in the hospital, of that one who had fallen from a wall." Here are still two more remarkable cases. Near home, clipped from a New York paper just a few days ago. If a playwright imagined a drama in which twin brothers each lost their left leg in World War, the kindly producer would say, "But you can't do this, old man, too much coincidence." If a novelist wrote a story in which twin sisters each gave birth to a child the same day, the publisher would say, "You're going too far. This isn't life. This is just coincidence." Old Mother Nature snaps her fingers at producers, publishers, and the skeptical public, too. Ernest Gridley of Toronto, Canada, and Harry Gridley of Winnipeg, Canada, on crutches. Both went to war in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces. Ernest lost his left leg at Regina Trench in 1916. Harry lost his left leg at Cambrai in 1917. They were twins. Mrs. Jean Roth of New York was visited by the stork at the Bronx Hospital, and on the same day in the same hospital in a ward a few paces away, Mrs. Beatrice Roberts received a visit from the stork. The sisters were twins. Children born at the same time in the same place must be under the same stars and must have the same destinies, and the truth of the statement has been proven more than once, not only by twins, who might properly be said to be influenced by the same hereditary and environment, but children of different families and different circumstances. I quote from an old volume published in London in 1837. In the newspapers of February 1820, the death of Samuel Hemings was noticed. It was stated that he'd been an ironmonger and prosperous in trade. He was born on the 4th of June, 1738, at nearly the same moment as the late Majesty George III. And in the same parish, in St. Martin's in Fields, that he went into business for himself October 1760, when his late Majesty came to the throne, and that he married on the 8th of September 1761, the same day as the king. And finally, after other events in his life that resembled those which happened to be the later king, he died Saturday, January 29, 1820, on the same day and nearly the same hour as his late Majesty. Another old authority tells the similarity between the Prince of Wales after George IV and a chimney sweep born the same day and hour in a substantially same locality. Of the career of the Prince of Wales, it's unnecessary to speak. His vices, his follies, his perjuries were all royal, and his fellow, the sweep, was not a jot behind him. The broom and scraper were found ill-adapted in the hands of one, scepter at the hands of another. The parents of Prince George, the chimney sweep, tried. Tired of his profligacy, which shamed their profession, finally established him as a tallow of Chandler. He was now a ruler with apprentices and coteries around him, and could follow the best of his genius. He was handsome, courteous, gallant, a spendthrift, a gamester, as testified before the age of 20, the fortune or reputation of a family having suffered more through his tendencies of this kind. He soon became famous as in his own sphere, dressed in the best style of class, was the idol of women and essence of politeness, the greatest bester and gamester that all the races and fairs within 10 miles of London, and finally kept the best asses and ran the best donkey races of the day. All this time the royal compeer was working out a destiny perfectly analogous, except that one is high life above, the other below the stairs, and one races with blooded horses, the other with a donkey. But all the glory must have an end. And the Prince of Wales became bankrupt, and Prince George smashed the very day that the stud of his Royal Highness Prince of Wales was sold by Tattersall. The racing donkeys and ponies of the other Prince George were put on the hammer. Sir Transit Gloria Mundi. Some of these similarities may be explained on the ground that even a cat may copy a king, but the fact remains that whenever a king and a hat have been found to be born under the same stars, there have been a close resemblance in their characters and careers. I might mention the often quoted cases of King Edward's double, who died May 6th, 1910, the same day as the king, and the Kaiser's double, whose children were born on the same dates as the German princes. There's something rather convincing, don't you think, about births and deaths? But let's go back for a moment to those days in St. Louis. I cannot leave them without quoting a letter written on the gray and crimson stationery of the Harvard Club of New York from an uncle of twins. My dear Miss Adams, knowing the boys in St. Louis as I do, the analysis which you've made is truly remarkable. To my mind, it proves beyond peradventure that astrology is an exact science. And then he added, my wife and I plan to have another child born in our family sometime next summer. If the month July is not a good time to have such a happening, I should appreciate your advice right away. July was a good time, I told him right away. In this matter of babies, women have special interests that men don't. They're the ones who have the babies, and they're naturally interested in knowing when it's safe to have them and easy. But the stars can only do the telling. The father and mother must do the doing. They have to cooperate. The mother is usually willing enough, but the father, well, some men just aren't as patient as they might be. They're also not as thoughtful as this uncle of twins who is now a father, thanks to astrology, of a promising July baby. Not long ago, one of my skeptical clients gave me the birth date of Governor Ghostback of Michigan. He didn't tell me the name, only that he was born in a certain place on a certain day of a certain year, but that's all I need to know about anyone, even a governor. I saw right away and told my client the man was neat in personal appearance, straightforward in manner, clear-headed in thinking, idealistic, conservative, inclined to be bashful. And then I said this person ought to be an old maid. As a matter of fact, the governor is a bachelor. Then I said, by the way, hasn't this friend of yours a rather peculiar gait? Yeah, he laughed. The man in front of me. He walks as if God had given him stilts instead of legs. I knew it just surely as if I'd seen Michigan's dignified executive stumping down the long corridor of the Dime Savings Bank building in Detroit. I knew it because he had Saturn and Mars in Capricorn. In short, the stiff-kneed sign had been dominant when he was born. I finally learned this man, whose knees I'd been so familiar, was governor of a great state, and I refused to abandon the astrological breastworks. I didn't care, I said, and say it now. The governor's parents ought to have been told about those knees and arranged to have their son born under other stars. I can afford to be patient with skeptics. I've seen science advance during my lifetime, from furtive subterranean cult rank to the ignorant with palm reading and fortune telling, to a legal position on a parity with many of the professions. I've seen the character of visitors in Carnegie Hall waiting room change from veiled women and men with ashamed averted faces to, well, your friends and mine. I've seen the confident astrologists gain recognition as useful, respected members of the community, and every day of my life I'm experiencing new proofs of astrological's infallibility. Just the other day, a visitor intent on tricking me gave me the birth dates of 2 children. I went through the usual process of consulting the reference books, scribbling calculations, and then I put away the charts. There's no use reading these horoscopes, I said. Why not? Said the visitor. because both of these children are dead by drowning. The caller had given me the dates of two children of Isadora Duncan who lost their lives when the dancer's automobile catapulted into the Italian River. I was mad, clear through, not because of the chance he had given me to rout one of astrologer's enemies. I loved that. But to think that there were still people in the world whose minds were so close to the marvelous powers in stars. So when the visitor gave me his own dates and swore to me that they were correct, I told him some things about himself that he won't forget. Moreover, I concluded, I could have told your mother the same thing the moment you were born. I have told her. If I had been in her If I had been in her confidence before you were born, before you were conceived, I would have told her the very best time of the year for her and for you in the world to have you born. I could have helped her understand you and trained you to protect you throughout your childhood. I could have assisted you yourself with a choice of profession and making a business associates especially favorable to you. I could have told you the periods in which you'd most likely be successful, when you should press forward with all your strengths, and the periods when you were almost sure to do wrong and go wrong, and to hang your resources and put another row of railings on your fences. I could have helped you in your choice of a wife in the beginning and raising of your own children, and I could have protected you from you and your family, through forewarning against many of the illnesses and accidents which threaten the physical man. I know I could have done all these things because I have done them, not one time, but 1,000 times, by letter and interview for all kinds of people all over the world. After he'd gone, I had a more peaceful think about his important reaction. How much better it would have been if I'd read the horoscope of those two Duncan children before they were born, before they were conceived. What a difference it would have made in history if Napoleon's parents had begot him under other stars. What a difference it would have made in your life and mine, if Kaiser's parents had exchanged his stars with, shall we say, Henry Ford. This concludes part 5 of The Bowl of Heaven by Evangeline Adams, narrated by me, Lori Carvelli of Three Keys Astrology.